Ladies and gentlemen, shots have been fired. If you think about it, God graped Mary in order to produce his son. And what's even worse is that biblical scholars place Mary's age at 14, which is a little Joseph Smithy. Science has made it abundantly clear that consent is an essential part of human well-being, and if you were raised Christian and are male, this may be a new word. Consent! Permission for something to happen or agree to do something. Now, given how an all-knowing God would be familiar with words like this, why did the conception story unfold the way that it did? So God basically shows up and kicks in the door and says, Mary, you'll never guess who's pregnant. You, which as an atheist is a bit of an eyebrow raiser. And given that God is apparently the only perfect being in existence, you'd think his approach would have been a little bit more, well, perfect. Imagine if God had instead approached Mary like this. Hey, excuse me, are you Mary? All-knowing. Anyway, I have this plan, and I was wondering if you wanted to be a part of it. Anyway, in a nutshell, there's this really, really benevolent guy. And he's basically going to be a scapegoat so that nobody has to own up to any of their shit anymore. Now, the problem is, this guy has to get to Earth, and I'm only all-powerful, so I clearly need a mother. And so I got to thinking, who's this person going to be? I mean, they've got to be really nice, and a stone-cold fox. And I figured that you might be that person. What do you think? Are you interested? Now, if I was an all-knowing God who could predict the future, I feel like I would have been pretty confident that she would have said yes, and so I could have just asked. Now, it seems to me that one of the most obvious giveaways that the Bible is a man-made fiction is how suspiciously similar God's ethical code is to the moral zeitgeist of the time. You know, it's almost like it's not the Word of God, but instead the writings of a bunch of sinister douche canoes who want to control and manipulate people for their own economic and political gain. Why else would Christians have to keep on evolving their God over time so that he stays up to date with the current set of moral standards? And given that Christians claim that their God is unchanging, why is it that he needs a software update every few books? And when God's definition of what good and evil looks like changes like the weather, are atheists really so crazy for being like, no thanks, I'm good, thank you? Here's what I see. So science comes along and says, okay, hot take. Beating a child is not a good way to mold them into a good person. And the believers are in an uproar. But we have a book, and it says... So question, given that God went out of his way to give us this book to help us to know him, why is it that we've had to continue updating it over time? As an example, let's take a look at how God views women and how that narrative has changed over time. Let's start with the Old Testament. They shall fall by the sword, their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child shall be ripped up. And while we're here, let's acknowledge that God does in fact have a view on abortion. But then after some coffee and a really good therapist, Jesus comes along and says, okay, that was a bit extreme. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And then in modern times, we have this narrative. This book presents the case that Jesus treated women equally with men, and he boldly broke the customs of his day to involve them in his work. But how? How did we get here?